Hi everyone, and welcome back to English 2. So this is going to be our first video of the week, in which we talk about ways in which you can read that will help you come up with things to write about. So specifically, a kind of set of methods of critical reading that should hopefully let you read in such a way that you will come up with interesting things to say, and maybe catch things that you would not have caught by reading it in a more maybe straightforward way. Basically, ways of reading that are designed to really kind of catch some of that subtext that we talk about with close reading, but that also will allow you to maybe sometimes bring in things outside of the text and relate them to what's going on within the text. So, specifically, we're going to do that through a kind of example piece of a short story by Ursula K. Le Guin called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And I'm going to kind of start off with a little biography of Ursula K. Le Guin because, well, we'll see when we get to those different ways of reading. One of them does involve looking at an author's biography. So we'll start off with a brief biography of Le Guin. So Ursula K. Le Guin, probably best known for being a science fiction and fantasy writer, though she did write in multiple different genres. She's probably best known for her Earthsea series of fantasy novels and for The Left Hand of Darkness, which was a really groundbreaking 70s science fiction story that did really interesting things with gender. By the way, any of you who are Studio Ghibli fans, the folks who did like Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke and Howl's Moving Castle, the movies. They did also do a movie called Tales from Earthsea. That is in fact based loosely on her Earthsea series of novels. They also, I believe, did a Sci-Fi Channel original miniseries of it, probably like 15 years ago now. It seems like it just came out to me, but I'm also getting old. So, Le Guin, well known, one of science fiction and fantasy author that is fairly well respected even outside of science fiction and fantasy, in part because The Left Hand of Darkness really kind of hit it big with not just like science fiction fans, but also like academics who were working with gender, and also just a lot of like general audiences. As an author, she's won tons of awards, including several for this story. Interestingly, she does have a sort of indirect connection with nativeness, although she's not native herself. I don't know if any of you in your American Indian Studies classes have read anything about Ishi, last of his tribe. Ishi's story is not a super happy one. Basically, he flees a massacre with his family in the 1860s, and they live basically in this sort of isolated existence, trying to, not be killed by white colonizers who killed like everyone else they knew. And this is, I think he was a member of the Yahi tribe, I believe. And then, over the years, all of his family and friends died. And he kind of ended up stumbling out into sort of the modern day California of the 19 teens, and yeah, it was he kind of became a bit of a phenomenon, both at the time as sort of this last vestige of of that tribal primitive life. You know how native culture tended to be presented in the past, and even still sometimes now. And this very much played into that idea that natives they're dead and gone, and they're just a relic of the past. And Ishi's life is not a super happy one. He is frequently ill. He has to work as a janitor. He dies of tuberculosis, I believe. And yeah, it's not a super happy story. But the connection here is that the anthropologist that Ishii worked with was Alfred Kroeber, who was the father of Ursula K. Le Guin. The K stands for Kroeber. So her father was the anthropologist who worked with Ishii, and her mother, Theodora, in her late in life, actually ended up becoming a successful author who saw kind of a repopularization of Ishii when she wrote a book in the 1960s called Ishii in Two Worlds, which again kind of, brought him back into popular culture. It became like a big best-selling popular nonfiction book. So basically, she kind of grew up. She never got to meet Ishii. He died, I think, like about a decade before she was born. But she knew many people who knew Ishii, including her parents. She grew up in this kind of West Coast California intelligentsia, academia circle. She grew up as the daughter of an anthropologist, and there are definitely folks who have argued that maybe you can see evidence of that in her work, and we'll talk about that in a second. So that's her biography, kind of out of the way, which I admit is more about Ishii. But yeah, I'm talking about what she wrote. She actually died several years ago, 2018. So, as I said, she did live into her 80s, and again, very, very well-known author. Like, she has more novels that folks talk about, things like The Dispossessed, but her biggest things are Earthsea and The Left Hand of Darkness, and then this particular story. I like to teach this story because it works really well for discussion. I'm really sad that we're not doing this week in person because this is one of those stories that really does lead to really good discussion in class. I'm hopeful that we'll get some good discussion going on the discussion board, but I also recognize that it's a very different medium and may not lend itself quite as well to the same kind of discussion we'd get in class. That said, last I heard, we are still on track to be in person next week, so I guess we will be seeing each other in person sooner rather than later. So, now we talked about Ursula K. Le Guin. Before we kind of really get into talking about Omelas, I like to bring up these different ways of critical reading. I think of them as like lenses through which you can interpret literature. Like if you look at something through like a sunglass lens, it's coloring everything you're seeing, but you're still seeing the things that are there. It just means you're seeing them in a different way. And with each of these, again, we tend to want to be working with textual evidence, like I mentioned when we talked about close reading. These lenses of looking through a story may or may not involve close reading. But like close reading, we still want to make sure that we're working from evidence that is there in the text or some other kind of evidence that we can argue for its relevance to the text. Because today we will be talking about, just as close reading is about going further into the text and focusing on the text itself. Some of the things we'll be looking at today involve taking things outside the text, but that are relevant to the text, and kind of trying to draw connections there. So, today I'm going to talk about 3 different ways or lenses through which to interpret literature. The first is philosophical or theoretical. The second is historical context. And the third is author biography. Hence the author biography at the beginning of this video. So, let's start off with our first one, which is philosophical theoretical. What this means is you're looking at your text, at your story, through an idea or a philosophy or a theory. You're using that as a lens through which to view your text. And if you've taken any kind of like American Indian Studies course that's looked at like literature or film or anything like that, you've already know how to do this, because that is what AIS does in terms of looking at texts of this sort, is looking at it through the lens of like native history and native culture and like focusing on the native characters in ways that folks who are not looking at it through that lens may miss. And because you're looking at it through these particular kind of perspectives, you may find out that you think about the story differently, or that you generally kind of pick up on things that a reader without that kind of context or without not coming from that perspective, they might not pick up on that. So, when you're looking at something like this through this lens, the story does work on its own. It's still got to work on its own as a story. But looking at it in the context of a tradition, a philosophy, an idea, it brings a lot more out of it and makes us think about it in things in it that we might not otherwise. So obviously this can include like Native Studies or American Indian Studies or whatever category name you're using for it. And it'll also include almost anything that gets followed by studies, whether that's gender studies, queer studies, African American studies, most of those like cultural studies, all of those are going to count as philosophies or ideas in this sense, or theories. It also includes class-based theories or philosophies like Marxism and its descendants. It will include reader response theories based on how readers react to a piece. It can also include more fringe stuff like monster theory or game theory, which are both very kind of specific sub-areas focused on a particular way of looking at things, a particular kind of smaller theory. So in this case, we have the story of Omelas, this perfect society, and the first half is all about how great it is and how perfect it is and how lovely it is, and it's wonderful, it's amazing, all these people are happy, and then we get this twist moment about halfway through where we discover that all of this happiness, and our narrator says, this may not seem realistic to you, like everything could be so perfectly happy. So how about this? And then our narrator goes on to tell us that all of this happiness, all of this perfection is reliant on the suffering of a single child in this like mop closet who like has to eat mush and like never gets a kind interaction and is like sitting in their own filth. Really not living a very good life. And then our story ends by talking about how the people of Omelas who find out about this child at a certain age, how they react. Those who, accept it as a necessary evil, those who, kind of have no problem accepting it versus those that really struggle with it. And then, of course, the people of the title, who are the ones who eventually walk away from Omelas, leaving everything behind. So, definitely interesting story, saying some interesting things. We have clearly the story that the linchpin, the key to the story is this child, this suffering child. And honestly, this is not probably the first time you've been exposed to the idea of, a lot of other people being able to have a good life as a result of one person or a few people having a bad one. There's a lot of different manifestations of this idea over, the millennia of humanity. Whether this is the idea of the scapegoat, whether this is the idea of, the good of the many versus the good of the few, or the greater good if you're a Harry Potter or Hot Fuzz fan. This is not a new idea that Le Guin is dealing with. Specifically, though the version that she, in her letter, writes that she was trying to engage with, is a version of this philosophy called utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is basically the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the right thing to do. And that sounds like pretty fine on the surface. Like, clearly you want to be doing the thing that's the best for the largest number of people. I mean, that just seems like logic, right? And yet, there are a lot of issues that come with that philosophy if you look at it in more depth. Again, Yes, this includes things like democracy. Like that's also working from the same idea. We go with what the majority of people think is, the best way to do things, and that's what we're going to do. But in a society where it's majority rule, or being done for the good of the majority, it sucks when you're not part of the majority. And I'm sure I probably don't need to belabor that point at too much length to students at Haskell Nations University. We all kind of have seen how that can go. Either personally, or in studying history, or with friends or family. At some point we all probably became conscious that in a lot of ways it can kind of suck to be a minority in a society that is not necessarily built around that. And specifically, when it goes really far, you can end up with something like, if any of you are Avengers fans, Thanos' kind of philosophy is very much along the lines of utilitarianism. What he says, kill millions to save billions, or kill billions to save trillions. He's very much all about, yes, this will suck if you're the part of that half of population that, gets snapped into dust, but it's going to be great for the people who are left, and it's going to allow your species to survive much longer. And yet he's the villain for a very good reason. This is a pretty monstrous thing to do, and that is in a lot of ways the issue with utilitarianism. Is that it works great in theory. In practice, it tends to not be great, especially if you're part of that group that is not part of the greater good, the greater number of people. And specifically, the Gwyn had been reading about the writings of, I believe, I think it was it Fourier, I think? One of the big utilitarianism philosophers early on. And she wrote this in response to a quote from an author named William James, or a philosopher named William James. And basically, the way that he put it was that if you had a world where these utilitarian philosophers that went further than any of them went, and millions were kept permanently happy at the one condition that a certain one person on the far-off edge of things should lead a life of lonely torture. What does it say about us, our emotional states, who we are as people, that our immediate thought is, although we're yeah, that happy, perfect life sounds great, we also recognize how awful that would be, and how, as he says, how hideous a thing would be its enjoyment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a bargain. So, and certainly, most people's reactions to this story is not, well, on the law seems great. It's a shame that, it just cost that one kid, but oh well. Most of the reactions are, this is terrible. This is awful. And it does say a lot about us as human beings that, that is our reaction. Our reaction is not, millions of people have a great life as opposed to this one, at the cost of this one child suffering. So, on the cosmic balance scales, we're way in the black. We're positive. And so here she's basically writing a story that kind of exemplifies that. That, no one's reaction to this story is usually, wow, this is a great setup. It's usually, oh my god, that poor kid. So, but looking at it through this lens makes you think about the story in a different way, and makes you also recognize the relevance of the story to other examples of, utilitarianism, majority rules kinds of setups in ways that you might not have otherwise. For example, earlier I compared it to democracy. What the most people think is the right thing to do is the thing to do is basically kind of an extension of utilitarianism. Does that make democracy a bad thing if, the story's bad? Not necessarily. On the other hand, you can make a lot of comparisons between Omelas and modern America. Something like democracy, but also something like fast fashion and electronics in the U.S. And how so much of that comes at the cost of, in developing countries, poorly paid or unpaid slave labor, occasionally also involving children. And, we tend not to think about that when, we're buying our new set of Nikes or purchasing a new iPhone. But, there's a very real human cost to a lot of these things that we tend to take for granted. And just as the people in Omelas do. And it's not like we can't or maybe don't even know about the way these things happen. We just tend not to think about it because it makes us feel uncomfortable, and we can because we're so far away from it. We don't have, the child in the broom closet in front of us 24/7. The child is off in the broom closet. All we see is the happiness. Or in this case, the iPhone and the Nikes. So, it definitely, looking at it through a philosophical lens, makes us look at the story differently. Another really kind of interesting version of the way to look at how utilitarianism can be a serious problem is I'm posting a clip from the TV show The Good Place, which I don't know if you've watched it, but it is a show where it's about characters who have died and have gone to the good place. And it turns out that at least one of the characters there is apparently there by mistake. And she was actually a really crappy person in life. And so rather than, have this administrative error pointed out, her goal is to try to become a better person. And this, of course, involves some level of looking at moral philosophy and what it means to be a good person and how to be a good person. It's also a very, very funny show. So hopefully you enjoy the clip. But the clip looks at a particular kind of version of utilitarianism called the trolley problem. You may have heard about this from any philosophy classes, or sometimes it gets brought up in high school. And the trolley problem is the idea that you're on a runaway trolley. The brakes are broken. You can't stop it. There's one thing you can do, and that is you can pull a lever to take it off the track it's currently on and onto another track. The track it's currently on is going to hit 4 people. Let's say they're workers on the track, and they can't hear you. You can't get them out of the way. If you continue on this track, they will, die. If you pull the lever and move it onto the other track, on that track there is one person. Also working, also can't hear you. If you switch it to that track, they will die. And the question is, what is the right thing to do here? And for most of us, our immediate reaction is going to be, well, pull the lever, because it would be better to only kill one person rather than 4. And from a utilitarian perspective, makes perfect sense. But then, that problem can get very complicated once you start bringing in any actual levels of nuance. What if the 4 people are strangers, and what if the one person is someone you know and like? What if the 4 people are elderly and the one person is a child? It's not as simple as 4 versus 1 means you're always going to just kill the one. If the 4 people are people who are in their 90s and the one person is a small child, you're probably not going to choose to kill the child just because counts as it may be, or such maybe that people in their 90s are probably not going to live too much longer anyway, and the child has their entire life in front of them. And so there's a lot. Or if the one person is a person you like and care about or love, and the 4 people are strangers or people you don't like, well, then that again, the 1 over the 4 to die is not necessarily the path you may go with. So there's a lot of ways that this kind of idea and principle that seems good, the good of the many versus the good of the few, can get really complicated, and this story kind of examines that. So, that is how looking at this story through that lens of utilitarianism and can really kind of make you think about the story differently, can make you make connections between it and modern day in ways you might not have normally. And I would generally venture to say that there are probably very few people who are looking at the ones who walk away from Omelas not through the perspective of utilitarianism, and then bringing up Avengers Infinity War like I just did. So, again, looking at it through this lens makes you look at it in a different way, and you come up with different things to say about it. Our second lens that we're going to talk about is using historical context. And that's going to involve thinking, what was going on around the time this story was written? What might it have been responding to in real life? What in real life might have inspired the writer? And what is it about the world in which this story was written that, affects or might have affected the idea of this story? How might it be reflecting the time and place in which it is written? There's a lot of crossover between this and author biography, because obviously the author is also living and writing in the time and place this is written. So the way we tend to distinguish is if it's focusing on the author's life and what happens to them personally, it's author biography. If it's focusing on things that are more societal, then we're going to go more into looking at it as historical context. So this was published originally in 1973. And certainly, the 70s are a very interesting historical moment. This is, a period where there's this, societally in America, there's this kind of huge disillusionment, post-Vietnam, post-Watergate. We're in this period where kind of this sort of idyllic, no one had ever thought, the United States was perfect. But during this period, largely with the rise of things like broadcast television in color, people are realizing that, holy shit, America has done some really shitty things on the national level. It really only takes, a few, full color videos of little girls having their skin burned off by napalm to make you kind of have a bit of a reevaluation of the way that things are happening. So we have this period where people are losing faith that the U.S. is a moral agent in all of its wars, with the way that the Vietnam War. People learn more about it, civilians learn more about it in ways that they kind of hadn't with previous wars, thanks to things like live television, and television news, and color TV. Seeing things in color makes it a very, very different. We also have this is an era where we lose a lot of faith in politics, where Richard Nixon almost stages a coup to take over the government and basically become a dictator, which it being president isn't enough. That's saying something. So this is a period. It's a period where Americans are having to come to terms with a lot of the crimes that America was founded on and that it has continued to perpetrate on many, many people. Whether that's Native American genocide. 60s and 70s we see the rise of AIM and kind of native rights movements. We're towards the end of at this point we've been through the worst of the civil rights movement, but that required a lot of coming to terms with a lot of really shitty parts of America's past. 1973 we're in the women's rights movement, which again is coming to terms with shitty way that a lot of folks were treated. Like there's a lot of like Latino rights movement is coming around at this point. We're not too far off from gay rights movement. Like there's a lot of disillusionment with the idea of America as this kind of perfect society, and coming to terms with the fact that a lot of the things that America was built on are objectively shitty ways of treating people. And like, you know, sometimes like straight up like criminal, like with murder and genocide and things like that. So you could definitely look at this kind of historical moment that's been going on around this time and apply that, look at the story through that lens and come away with some very interesting and previous ones you might not have, takes you might not previously have had on the story. Like, certainly you could easily make the case that this is very much critiquing America, and that also might make you look very differently at the people of the title, the ones who walk away, but who don't actually make anything better. Like they don't save the kid, they just walk away and no longer participate in the society, but, you know, this kid is still there in the broom closet, you know, sitting in a pile of their own feces. So, like, maybe there are better ways to do things than just, you know, not engage with it. Maybe we do have to require a certain level of, like, active engagement with our past sins as a society. All these are things you can get by looking at this story through the lens of, like, the kind of period around 1973. But interestingly, this also then becomes influential on a lot of other sort of kind of utopia/dystopia stories about, you know, future perfect societies and future, you know, societies that may seem perfect on the surface but are actually like god-awful and horrible. And actually, I think the most recent Omelas reference that I'm aware of is if you are a BTS fan. Their music video for Spring Day, their song, actually does at some point, I believe, pay homage to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Like, bet you weren't expecting to learn a fact about BTS today. But here you go. That's what looking at literature through these lenses that bring in external info can do. So, that's kind of how looking at things using historical context work. What's going on around the time this was written, and what might it have been responding to on like a societal, cultural level. Then we come to our third part, which is author biography. So, this is going to be looking at what was going on in the author's life that maybe affected their writing. It's kind of very similar to historical context. Again, as with historical context, it's you kind of have to be speculative. You cannot 100% say, yes, this is what caused this. Like, yes, Ursula K. Le Guin was writing this as a critique of, you know, American, like, exceptionalism and the idea that America is perfect, and, like, blind patriotism and nationalism. And you could make a case for that, but you can't know that for sure because, you know, A, Le Guin is dead and you can't ask her, and B, like, she didn't really write saying that she was doing that. That said, that doesn't mean she wasn't doing it. Again, just because someone's not saying they're doing something on the surface doesn't mean they're not still communicating it. But nevertheless, with these things, we largely have to list them as like maybes, unless we have, you know, the author actually coming out and saying, like, yes, I base this on reading about utilitarianism, which Ursula K. Le Guin did come out and say she did. So, like, you don't really have to make a case for looking at it through utilitarianism because, you know, she already did that for you. That said, there are many other philosophies you could look at this through, and you might come away with something very, very different. And again, you don't necessarily have to make a huge case that she was trying to do that at the time, but even sometimes, you know, authors are not always conscious of what they're doing, and sometimes what they're doing just comes off differently because a society has changed. Like, a great example of this is like something like Huck Finn, where actually at the time it was kind of scandalous because, you know, it treated, like, Jim, who was a runaway black slave, as, like, a genuine person. And, like, it pissed a lot of racists off. Nowadays, because society has marched on so far, the big issue tends to be with Huck Finn is that it drops the N-word so many times. And, like, that word has so many negative connotations that, like, that can be really alienating to read as a black reader. And so, even though this was something that was very anti-racist in the day, now it tends to, like, no, we don't recognize that still. But definitely, like, now the reason it's uncomfortable to read is kind of in the other direction, is that, you know, it's dropping this racist term a lot. So that's a situation where just, like, the march of values has changed this thing that was kind of groundbreaking at the day, and nowadays it's like, it doesn't make it any less good, it doesn't make it any less anti-racist, really. But the bar to be anti-racist was a lot lower in, like, the late 1800s when Huck Finn was written, than it is, you know, in 2022. And so, something that was anti-racist then, by those standards, nowadays may still be very uncomfortable to read for racism purposes, for racism reasons. So, again, sometimes it's just a matter of, you know, time marching on. Sometimes it is just something that the author never really, you know, probably considered or really looked at. And here you run into things like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. If you've seen the movies, read the books. Women are short on, like they're very thin on the ground in those books. The Hobbit has no women in it in the book. The only named female character is Bilbo's mom, who is dead at the time the story takes place. So, like, it's a sausage fest. Which is why when they made the movie, you know, they specifically brought in some female characters from Lord of the Rings, like Galadriel, and they also straight up created a female character in Evangeline Lilly's Toriel, because it was considered acceptable for him to, you know, again, values change. It's acceptable for him to write a story that had, like, basically just had no part for half of the world's population in, you know, the 40s when he wrote The Hobbit. Can't really make a movie in, you know, the 20-teens that straight up has no women in it, that is not, like, you know, an R movie. And even then, like, you're still going to have, like, some women somewhere in it. Now, does this mean that J.R.R. Tolkien hated women? Like, probably not necessarily. Like, when he did write women, you know, Galadriel, Arwen, Éowyn, and Lord of the Rings, some of them are at least decent characters. That said, there are basically, like, 2 female characters who play an actual major role in things out of, like, 25 plus major characters in Lord of the Rings. But then you look at Tolkien's autobiography, and a lot of it suddenly makes sense. Because pretty much every environment he spent his adult life in was entirely male-oriented and male-dominated. He was in the army during World War I, which at that point was pretty exclusively male, especially on the front lines. Then he was a university student, when universities were male only. Then he became an Oxford professor, faculty, when most faculty and students were male. When he started teaching, women were only just being allowed into Oxford, and then only in female-only colleges, with female-only faculty and female-only students. So even though women were finally being allowed to go to college, it was like, yes, but you have to go to the ladies' part of the college, with lady teachers and lady students. So, if you think about this, maybe it makes a little more sense. He was kind of writing what he knew and from his experience, and in the areas that were important to him at the time, and which kind of correspond to the things in the story, wartime career, there were pretty much no women. Like, he associated women with home. Like, he did get married and have kids. He did have, you know, was close to his mom as a child. But that was specifically home and domestic. This was a kind of 19th century perception of women. And there's not a ton of, you know, at home and domestic in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. Like, they're all, out on adventures or at war, and these were situations that he did not associate women with, and so he did not put women for the most part in them. So, that situation where looking at the way a person lived their life may help make sense of a decision in their books that might seem odd or unusual. So again, with Omelas, Ursula K. Le Guin, her dad was an anthropologist. There are a lot of folks who have made the case that she takes a very kind of anthropological view in her writing. There's a lot of looking, especially with science fiction and fantasy, there's so much of that involves, creating new societies and looking at them from a human nature perspective. And anthropology is great for that. Stuff like anthropology and sociology. And so people have made really good cases for that. And again, maybe sort of tying in with the sort of author biography, you can bring in her own letter, which, was specifically, here's how what I'm writing is being influenced by something I'm currently reading and inspired by it, which we've talked about how it falls into the philosophy theory kind of lens, but it also falls into autobiography lens. She said what she was doing, and sure enough, we can see it in their work. So, and these are just 3 different lenses through which you can look at a story. They are, you're by no means limited to these. Again, as I mentioned, you can use close reading as part of any of these, but you don't have to, and by the same token, you can close read without doing any of these things. Like I said earlier, close reading is a form of critical reading, but it's not the only way to do that. And here are some of the other ways that you can mix or match. So, hopefully you found this helpful. I'll be putting up some questions about Omelas on our discussion topic. Do check out that A Good Place clip, because it is, I think, a great discussion or a great depiction of the trolley problem. And it's also pretty funny. And then for our second video of the week, we will be looking at... we will start looking at the elements of fiction, the main 6 elements of fiction, and we will also learn about and talk about the first one, which is plot. So you have that to look forward to. In the meantime, hope you all weather the prophesied snowpocalypse that is coming up tonight and tomorrow and I think early into Thursday. Hope you weather that well and stay safe and warm. And I will see you in our next video.